I think it's almost exactly like the internet. So, for people who are old enough to have experienced the internet, I'm sure there's plenty of bubble from a finance point of view or from an investment point of view, but I do not think there's a bubble as far as the impact.
Welcome to Keep It Local, a podcast of the Local Media Association. The Local Media Association is intensely focused on helping local media companies discover new and sustainable business models. Welcome to Keep It Local. I'm your host, Ryan Welton with Local Media Association, and today we are joined by somebody I've known for several years, one of the smartest people I know, Ethan Holland. Ethan is not only the vice president of Draper Digital Media, but he also sits on the LMA board of directors. And I know I'm injecting some opinion here, but Ethan is one of the brightest minds in terms of AI that you're going to find. A lot of people post things to LinkedIn. Ethan has a full-on newsletter, and he writes about AI every week for at least the past year, maybe two. Ethan, you've written about AI 2 years. You've written about AI extensively on your website, ethanbholland.com, and I'll make sure that that's in show notes. And in each post, Ethan not only writes about various AI experiments he's undertaking, and he shows you what they look like and how he did them, but he also incorporates headlines and news from the world of AI. And I have so many questions for you, Ethan, hopefully ones that apply to you, the listener, as well. Welcome, Ethan. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for having me, Ryan.
Well, my first question is because the listener, if you are listening to this or you're watching this on YouTube and you want to pull up another tab and go to ethanbholland.com, you'll see what I'm talking about. This week in AI, number 1, number 2, number 3, we're up to number 113, I believe. What inspired you to so proactively learn about AI yourself and then write about it, educating others?
Well, I've always loved curating content, and I think I always was a little self-conscious about my pack rat, almost squirrel mentality of information. So my whole life, that's been something I've done. I've collected all types of information since the analog age, and when I saw ChatGPT come out, it to me, I was always also pretty good at trends, but also a little shy about that. But when I saw GPT, I thought, look, this is a good opportunity to take all of who you are and have some fun with it and not be embarrassed that I love curating. And I really need to know it. So I figured what would be the best way to learn a new emerging technology than to document it. So I do this mostly for me, even to this day, and I force myself to publish what I see, but I am really doing it for my own benefit to stay sharp and up to speed.
That makes a lot of sense. And having read your work for quite a while, I can't rightfully ask you to tell me everything you've learned. We don't have time for a 5-hour podcast because that's what it would turn into. But let me ask you this. Because of this weekly process and because essentially we're starting Keep It Local in 2026 with the topic of AI, how would you describe the state of AI to start 2026? A lot of people say that there might be a bubble here.
I think it's almost exactly like the internet. So, for people who are old enough to have experienced the internet, I'm sure there's plenty of bubble from a finance point of view or from an investment point of view, but I do not think there's a bubble as far as the impact and, the emerging technology itself. So, we can look at stocks or investments, all these billions being thrown around and say it's a bubble, but I do think just the way the internet did not go anywhere, I think AI is becoming, especially in 2026, being used. I think the last stat I saw was 50% of people at work use it almost daily. So, whether or not we say out loud whether we like it or not, and we use it in many different ways, of course, that's another challenge, is it's being defined in all sorts of and it's not a very well-defined topic, but its usage is becoming mainstream, and I don't think there's a bubble as far as its abilities.
Are there any particular ways that newsrooms are using AI that you think are better than others? For example, in my experience, sometimes I would use it to check AP style or just to check for grammar, make sure I didn't misspell a word. Is there anything right now that may be new in AI that newsrooms ought to look into in terms of using an LLM?
Think the LLM is a good sort of segue to my answer because I think using AI as a chatbot is probably a little bit dated. I think I'd like to redefine AI as not just being chit chat or conversation or a writing tool, but more as a multimodal, audio, video, image understanding tool. So the ability of AI to digest lots of information and then concisely tell you what it's about as a partner is a really great opportunity to save time. So whether or not newsrooms are using that specifically, I think that the ability to give AI a lot of data and have it talk to you about it is an incredible skill. And moving away from just chat to audio, visual understanding, less about outputting content and being a writing tool, which I think is a stereotype, and more about being like a wingman or an assistant to help you digest quite a bit of information and help you process it.
Well, Ethan, I will tell you because of a lot of what I've learned from you, I have used that in my own personal life just that way as kind of a wingman. I've even given my chat GPT a name. I call him Lou Grant from the old Lou Grant show and then Mary Tyler Moore before that. I keep it, and he's helping me with a lot of nutritional things and food and dietary choices and whatnot, but it's like a wingman. And I happen to prefer Chat GPT. I'm running my own experiment with Google Gemini, and I'm using that for some things with ChatGPT, and I've just latched on as that's my preference. And people are familiar at least with the name ChatGPT and Gemini and Perplexity and maybe even Claude. Do you have a preference, or what do you? How would you describe the differences between all of those LLMs?
It is a very nuanced and personal choice, and I think a lot of it has to do with your personal experience. And because this is a news audience, I do think it's important to call out that the API-based conversations people have versus a chat window conversation are going to be a lot different. I would like to shout out a couple of, you asked me how newsrooms are using it. I think if you're a enterprise style newsroom, there are a lot of regulations and it's very different than personal use. And in that case, there are some really strong products like Elvex or the stuff that John Acarino is doing with his Ordo digital group. And that's something where I think enterprise API is always a little different than personal use. But I use the APIs as much as I use the chat rooms. And my favorite, I still go to GPT. And I use GPT 5.2 thinking more than anything else, and I force it to be thinking mode. I'm not a big fan of the instant or auto options, even now. I think Claude is incredible. It's tough. I feel like it's Mac versus PC at this point, and to be honest, I don't really have a favorite. It's just what I'm used to. So I use Claude as almost a counterpoint to GPT, and I'll play them against each other for code or for documentation. If it's for writing, I really do like Claude to proofread work. And I wanted to tell you one use case that may be something a little bit unique to me is just how much I like to use it as a dictation device. I've found that the ChatGPT's Mac app, so I'm not talking about using my phone, and I'm not using, I can't use my phone, but I like the Mac app the best. I turn on the microphone and it uses the native whisper, I believe, or some variation, as opposed to using the text to speech translate or vice versa, speech to text translation that the Mac uses when you just have the microphone. I really like GPT's native audio understanding. So I actually talk to it and dictate, and it records me almost like a wave file. It's not doing speech to text. And then when I stop, it has about a 4-minute window till it gets overwhelmed. I do 4 minutes at a time, and the prompt is usually something like, "Hey, I'm going to talk out loud, and I want to be able to dictate to you and go back and change my thoughts. I don't want you to change any words I'm saying. I don't want you to do anything other than clean up my free associative thoughts." And it crushes it. So if you're trying to brainstorm or just dictate, it's a really good tool for that. And to be honest, that's one of my favorite use cases is just being able to think out loud and have output that's clean. But it's not changing my language or anything like that. That's very important to say.
Something I want to point out to the listener is just how detailed Ethan was with his prompt. Prompt engineering, they call it. And you only would you agree with this statement? You only get out of these tools what you put into it. And could you speak maybe to the specificity that's required to get good output?
Sure. Well, that's a controversial and very personal opinion. It's almost like any kind of nutrition advice or running or fitness. People have so many thoughts about diet. I think prompting is very similar for people who think they have the key. I'll tell you, my since I use it a lot, my point of view is that number one, I've read studies and benchmarks that say the old tricks are no longer necessary and don't change anything. So telling it that it's a lawyer doesn't make it better at the law. Telling it you're a doctor doesn't help. Threatening it that you're going to fail a test if it doesn't do a good job may or may not still do a little bit. But for the most part, they're getting very good at just getting the idea. But what I will say is I jam pack it with as much as I can, which is again why I use the dictation tool. You would get sick of me describing a prompt because you would get worn out by me chatting too much. You would also have a strong opinion on how really concise I was or how eloquent I was with the order of which I told you my prompt. But I've come to the conclusion, total case study of one, that more is better. And I will just talk out loud about my prompt. And if I want to add stuff to the end, I no longer care. I know that front loading used to be the thing, and you always wanted to say the most important thing first. But unless you're really blowing the context window, I think just get everything onto the paper and then hit go. And I write my prompts from scratch every time. I know some people save them, but I am particular that every time I have a task, I speak to the task and I take the effort. I have some things that I copy and paste, but I still add some nuance.
There are tools out there that do some very specific things that aren't necessarily LLMs, I don't think. We're on one right now, Descript. It has a very specific purpose. Canva, there's a lot of AI built into Canva. There's Gamma. You were one of the first users of Hey Jen that I ever saw. I remember the videos. I believe that was the tool where all of a sudden you were speaking French. I thought, oh, wow, Ethan knows French. Uh, are there one or two of these tools that work so well that they've blown you away that would apply to folks in newsrooms, whether it be video, audio, image creation?
I think newsrooms have a variety of technology abilities. So, a smaller newsroom may not be able to run a locally hosted model, right? But a larger newsroom may have a whole product team that does all sorts of cool stuff. So, I think when it comes to just the wow factor of consumer products, I think that Notebook LM is still really cool from Google. I think Gemini is really cool from Google for doing infographics. Whether or not you use them in a newsroom is another question, but just from a pure just amazement of using a tool, if you give Gemini a lot of information, it will make a really pretty graphic that an infographic. And in fact, Google is integrating Gemini, of all things, into its AI search results to essentially diffuse the user interface. So instead of having a structured, predetermined result of like 10 links that show you after your question, if you said something like, "Hey, I want to understand RNA and how it works," it may actually build you a graphic using Nano Banana or something inside the search result that's a visual aid. And so I think Notebook LM and some of these Google products that just do so well at taking audio and video and then processing them into an output, that's a really fun thing. As far as, more of the another one, I guess, would be Adobe has introduced a ton of really good stuff. I think they're AI tools for editing. Again, these aren't creating graphics, but if you want to remove a background or relight a photo or just white balance something, these tools are incredible. Um, I think that Amazon Nova is a really cool model. There's a lot of really neat models that are open sourced. Those are a little trickier for the layperson, but optical character recognition has gotten really good. The ability to create structured data out of an unstructured document. There's a good example of a open source software that I forget the name off the top of my head, but you can they could probably all do it now, but you can give it like Romeo and Juliet and it will structure every character's appearance and their emotional state in every single scene. So it's a very unstructured Shakespeare. getting turned into a structured output. So I think there's a lot of things that if you're creative, the sum is greater than the parts. And that's really where I would focus. If you have the resources, you could build something using open source that would be quite amazing at a very low cost.
I'll tell you, this podcast, Keep It Local, one tool I use with Adobe is their podcast editing tool. And what I'll do is that I'll bring the video and audio into Premiere. I'll disassociate the audio from it, bring it into Audition, but take that WAV or that MP3 file and run it through podcast.adobe.com. It's as good as mastering. I've kind of thought, Ethan, it's going to put the mastering business, the mastering world out of business. It's really good.
I'm old enough to have said that I used Adobe Photoshop before there were layers. So there was no such thing as a mask, which is hard to believe. And I remember the mask concept confused me when it first came out because the idea of multiple layers was just so cool. Um, but a lot of things like that are now, there's no moat. Knowing how to use a technology and mask something used to be a manual effort. And I was proud of myself that I could do that. Now you just click a button and it selects objects. And that's something else I would add to the list of things that wow me right now. It's a discipline of AI called segmentation, and that's when you are able to select an object and then track it. And then the corresponding term would be depthing. So if you were able to outline me and you as the two people on this podcast, that would be segmenting us. But if you were able to outline my pictures in the background and your banner in the background and your lamp, and then have a color code of how far away each one was from the camera, like a heat map. That would be called depthing. And segmentation and depthing are one of the most cool technologies. Obviously, in sports, it allows you to track a hockey player, but you can now interact with things in plain language. So I could say, select the picture behind Ryan with the white mat, and it will do it. So you're not even using your mouse anymore. You're just selecting objects. And I think if you're in the sports business or in the real estate business, or even in just, you want to find data centers, you're in the investigative journalism business, you could say, I want to look at the sat pictures and show me any object that's a certain size that looks square, like it's a data center. And it can just mine this data and then give you pictures. Or show me all the pools in this aerial photo. It'll highlight every pool, and you can actually talk to it. So I think people, if I had to think of something that not a lot of people think about, I would say the two terms would be segmentation and depthing. And the tools, if you just want to find them, would be Meta has Segment Anything, which is a really strong tool. ByteDance has one. And then there's a newer model called Kimmy Moonshot. And Moonshot, it's a great name. Moonshot has a really great segmentation tool as well. And they're all open source. So you could download them and play with them.
Fascinating. I will tell you that in my own personal use, I've used a lot of things like Suno and Adobe Podcast just to experiment and try things. But the depth of knowledge, Ethan, that you have about this, I really must insist if you're listening to this that you go to ethanbholland.com and just read about what Ethan is doing each week in these This Week in AI columns. I want to segue, if we can, to a topic that is near and dear to folks in journalism, and that's the ethical use of AI. Most newsrooms have policies now, whatever they may be. Is there anything new from the past few months or to start 2026 that newsrooms might be overlooking in their policies?
I want to, I can't speak for all different corporate styles. I do think that the consistent feedback I've heard from most of my peers is that individual responsibility is really the trick, because if you're putting your name on something, that means you signed off on it. So, spell check is AI. I don't think that spell check counts, but writing an article is not a good idea from scratch. But if you use it in a way that is spell checking or adjusting copy in a certain way, everyone's tolerance is different. But if I rewrite my own work, or if an AI rewrites my own work, that is up to me to read it and decide whether I sign off on it. So it's almost like the Folger's taste test of authenticity. If it passes muster as authentic and it is factually accurate and it stands up against scrutiny because you proofread it, I think that is really the key. You cannot blame the AI, and that to me is something that I don't know why that was ever allowed. When people put out they kind of take down AI about a story that was published and it was so bad because AI wrote it. Well, that's the writer's fault for doing such a dumb idea, you know? So personal responsibility really is up to, but as far as disclosing it, I think that's probably the hardest trick because auto white balancing your video is not, in my mind, AI, even though it is. But man, if I just prompted, a historical photo that never occurred, that's fake. It's fraud, and that's wrong. So I don't know how much the policy has to be about AI. It's just about having integrity and not lying. To me, we're almost overcomplicating it. And then the other thing I've heard about policies is that they have to be a little more flexible now. Back in the day, they were very draconian. And I think that still applies when it comes to privacy and corporate data. And if you can't, putting it into an LLM, you don't want to put corporately sensitive documents into the LLM. There has to be policy for that. But there also has to be the ability for people to test and learn and play because I couldn't give you a DSLR camera and expect you to be good at it if you didn't go out and take a couple pictures first and learn because you maybe have the shutter speed wrong and your picture's blurry. Well, you fix it. So you have to be able to tinker with a tool to get good at it. And that is something I think is really important is to enable employees to play in a safe way to learn this stuff without banning tools. That would be my personal opinion.
You and I both come from the local TV news world. Do you have any concerns right now about the usurpation of talent identity or even journalist identity? Trust is so important in journalism, but there are a lot of companies that are like, "Whoa, we need to protect our talent from AI creating sort of like lifelike models of them."
Yeah, that's a very personal decision, and I think everyone deserves the right to their likeness. So that's kind of my short answer is you should be able to be you and control you. And if you're excited and want to be, multiplicity like Michael Keaton back in the day and have 22 Ryans out there, there's a guy out there who does the rundown. I forget his full name. I believe it's Rowan. But this guy has a newsletter called The Rundown, and he has an AI avatar that he uses to make YouTube videos. And it's him making those videos of himself. It's not someone stealing his likeness. So if you're into it and you want to do cool stuff, I think you should totally do that, but it needs to be your choosing. And I think that should not be controversial. There should be no Ryan that you don't know about doing anything out there.
Comes down, just like you said, to common sense and personal responsibility.
And there has to be precedent because I do understand that, there's a lot of ability from AI. There's a joke that for the first 2 weeks of any new image model, you can make celebrities and then they turn it off because they want it to go viral, right? So they want you to be able to be in the car with LeBron James having a Starbucks or whatever you want to do to show off to your friends how good this tool is. And they tend to play with the rules a little loosely. And I think that's a fair criticism, but the potential for AI is insane. And I go back to that open source concept, bad actors using an open source tool that doesn't have guardrails. That is a very legitimate fear of deep fakes and things like that. So you asked me a question more about your likeness being yours. I do believe everyone should have that right. But as far as the fear goes, I do think the propensity of the ability for a person without any technical skill to make a very convincing false anything is a real issue. But again, is that an AI thing? Because people have been writing falsities and forgeries for hundreds of years. I think it's more of a people problem.
It does sound like a people problem. I want to ask you for some people predictions. This is everybody. I love predictions episodes, and I don't know if you've thought about what might happen this year. And it could be in terms of the technology. It could be in terms of newsroom acceptance of AI. It could be anything. Do you have a crystal ball, and what do you see for 2026 in the world of AI?
Well, it's a really good counterpoint to the scary stuff we just talked about because I think, the only reason I'm learning about AI is because I see its potential to be so harmful or so helpful. So when you ask me what's coming ahead, I think medicine is going to have some incredible benefits. There was just a study I heard on NPR this week where doctors were really co-signing how good AI is for medicine. And it wasn't about hallucinations or you're going to get a fake, report from a bad query on GPT. This was a doctor basically, again, talking about structured data and just how hard it is to talk to a patient for such a brief amount of time and learn an entire medical history. And you're bouncing from specialist to specialist. So the ability for AI to consolidate, find patterns, see an image, it's bigger than the news. I think just like the internet was bigger than the death of print, there's a lot when we talk about a topic. So I would be remiss to not say medicine is a big deal. I think that you're asking me for the crystal ball. I think that people will start to see AI show up in ways that are way far away from a chatbot. So there's a term called emerging intelligence or emerging talent. I don't know what you would call it, skills. We're seeing that happen with scale. And without being too nerdy, one a great example, which I wish we could show it here, but I'll try to. If anyone wants to, they could find me, or you could Google it. But Google Gemini's Nano Banana image tool is so good that if you take a screenshot of Google Maps and draw an arrow that just has an arrow. So let's say it's a screenshot of the San Francisco Bay, and you draw an arrow pointing towards the bridge. You can ask a Nano Banana, what do you think the arrow sees? And it will draw you a picture of the vantage point of that arrow on that map looking at the bridge from that angle. And that would be called like an emerging trait because it's not just generating a picture of a funny image that you thought of. It's looking at the arrow you drew on the map and pointing to the bridge. So I think in video, that becomes even more powerful because it's more dimensional. And so you're seeing physics models and simulation tools coming out of video, which are starting to empower robot embodiment, which I think some people could say is, I even feel self conscious because you're like, yeah, sure, robots. I believe that in the next few years, you're going to see actual robots who can look around the room and pick up your laundry and do cool things. So long term, I think you got robots. Short term, I think you got medicine and then also agentic behaviors. So probably from a consumer point of view, the ability to just to call a restaurant and make a reservation on your behalf without being on hold. You could just say, hey, book me a reservation at this restaurant for a party of two. Text me when you've got it. You'll start having some pleasant customer service relationships as opposed to painful ones in the next few years.
That all sounds fantastic, and if I can back you up on the medicine, I recently had my annual physical. Well, when I got the labs back, just took the numbers. It doesn't have to be me. These are just numbers. I took all the numbers, put them into ChatGPT, and I said, "What do you think of this?" And it was able to extract the relationships between that reading and that reading, and it gave me what I thought was a really intelligent just output in terms of what that was, and I thought it was really helpful. It was context. I mean, I went to the doctor for what I needed to go to the doctor for, but ChatGPT helped so much with understanding.
Yeah, and I think that these benchmarks are always helpful too, because some people I could see very rightly so would say, "Hey, you shouldn't trust AI to give you medical advice." Well, first of all, I don't think you're trusting it. You're just checking out an idea, right? Because if it says, "Hey, you look great, Ryan," then cool. But if it's like, "Hey, you got a problem, buddy," you might as well follow up. So I think blindly following anything is a bad idea, but having a second opinion is great. And I will underscore even for myself as a pretty early adopter, benchmarks are important. And right now, the medical benchmarks are really strong. And I think China just did they did a study where they brought specialists, the best in the country at each specialty. So pick 30 different disciplines of medicine, and they went head to head against AI. And generally speaking, I think it was still a tie that the AI and the best human were about the same. However, the best human took 18 to 25 minutes to get the response, and the AI was about 12 seconds. So I don't see a harm in double checking things, of course, but even beyond that, the ability for enterprise medical devices to look at a CAT scan and actually, I think just 2 years ago, AI could predict breast cancer 5 years early by looking at mammograms, and that's. I mean, hey, if it's going to save a life, I think this is really important.
You underscored how well AI does in terms of doing things faster than what humans can. And newsrooms, marketing departments, we're all fearful of AI taking jobs, but I think there's a lot of benefit in taking tasks that AI can do in a newsroom that'll free up reporters to do more enterprise investigative reporting.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good tools out there that I think are well known that can take transcripts of public, and there's public audio files available that you don't have enough time to listen to. So the additive effect is really cool, right? I think there's always going to be plenty of work to do. It's just that you can have it work for you. Again, we talked about that agentic concept of the next year, just putting something to work for you and coming back a couple, you could ask it a question, go to dinner, come back, have your answer. Why not, right? So I think there will be the moats will be going away. I think a lot of the traditional internship ideas could be replaced with AI. I think it's gonna be very hard for young people leaving college to find that foothold. I heard someone, I forget, I wish I could give credit to this, but someone said the ladder's still there, for upward mobility, but they've removed the first 2 rungs. And I think that's a tough thing if you're a kid. So I think for people in place, it's gonna be a wonderful tool, but for people just leaving college, it's gonna make the market challenging.
Ethan, we've talked about a wide scope of things. I hope we get a chance to do this more often on the Keep It Local podcast. If you were listening to this on a podcast and you want to give us a 5-star review, that sure is helpful for the algorithm to help other people discover it. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe, leave a comment, leave a question. I'll make sure it gets to Ethan, and I will make sure in both the show notes and in the description for YouTube and the podcast show notes to have your website, ethanbholland.com, out there. Ethan Holland, Vice President of Draper Digital Media and LMA Board of Directors board member, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants to chat.
This has been Keep It Local, a podcast of the Local Media Association. If you got value out of today's podcast, why not give it a review wherever you heard it and share it with a fellow journalist or an entire newsroom? Until next time, for Keep It Local, this is Ryan with the Local Media Association.